Today on Behind the Headlines, we're going to talk about airplane noise. And to get the latest on that, we welcome Deputy City Manager for the City of Palo Alto, Michelle Poché Flaherty. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here.
This issue has a complex history. Sue, you've been covering it since the beginning, since NextGen was implemented. And it's driven in no small part by the fact that the problem and the solutions really are at the federal level, which is different for the city. We're used to having control over the roads and zoning codes and things like that. This is a totally different ballpark. It seems like there's been a lot of citizen advocacy. There's been attempts to coordinate regionally. There have been formal requests to the FAA. But my sense at this point is that despite hopes, the city and citizens are maybe not at the place that we had hoped we would be by this time. And maybe we're in a period of reassessing where do we go from here. Michelle, what's the city's take on where things stand with the FAA and with this issue?
I think you really captured it well when you said that we're not where we'd like to be or where we'd hoped we would have been. Mm-hmm. For folks who've been following the issue, there was a select committee that met for a period of time and did a lot of hard work locally to try to bring different voices in the community together to figure out what some pretty realistic solutions might be to the challenge. And we've had a lot of citizens do a lot of homework and really work hard at learning how does the FAA work, how does air traffic control work, and how can we at the local level in the community bring some practical solutions to this big federal agency and to try to figure out how we partner from the sort of the ground up. And the FAA took all of that input from the select committee and from the San Francisco Airport Roundtable and spent a lot of time reviewing it all and considering it, and came back and issued a report to respond to all of these ideas. And unfortunately, just about every idea that Palo Alto came up with, the answer was, that just isn't going to work.
That's disappointing.
It's really disappointing.
What were some of their reasons? Like for some of the specific solutions, obviously the big one is the fact that there's this huge traffic jam in the air over the Menlo Waypoint near Palo Alto. And I know one of the big ideas is to kind of disperse the flights a little bit, have less concentration. But it sounds like the FAA, at this point at least, isn't going to go that route. And what is their kind of logic behind rejecting that recommendation?
They explained in their report that because there's 3 airports involved, Palo Alto is mostly affected by arrivals coming into San Francisco Airport. And if you want to move those flights over, they're at risk of bumping into the San Jose International Airport airspace. Mm-hmm. And so when we say, well, if you could just move them a little bit to the east or a little bit to the north, it's really important to us that we not make our problem somebody else's problem. So we don't want to advocate for moving the planes from flying over our houses to flying over someone else's houses. So we've really worked hard to say, well, what about over the bay where there aren't any residents? What about over the mountains where there's very few residents? And time and again, the only way the FAA can see to send the planes in those directions is to push them into other airspace that's already crowded with other designated routes and for other airports. So they were unable to find a way to make any of our suggestions work.
Mm-hmm. What about the idea of flying higher when passing Menlo?
That's the other one, yes. So we've said if you can't move them farther away, at least have them fly higher. And we had some hope around that because there is actually an agreement in place between San Francisco Airport and the air traffic control folks to try to do that. So we were hopeful that compliance with that standing agreement was something that we could get some affirmation around. What we found in the report is while the FAA acknowledged the agreements there and that they do support it when they can, the report went on to say that they can't really make it work very effectively. And if I can oversimplify this, it's because as the planes are flying in to land at SFO, they have to come down at a certain rate in order to be safe. And so if the final approach is here and Palo Alto is here, they have to be low enough so that they will be at the right height when they land. So to make them higher in Palo Alto, they would actually have to then fly around some more to get down low enough to land properly. And if they had to fly around some more, they'd be back in the San Jose airspace again, for the San Jose International Airport. So that was the answer the FAA gave us.
Would that include if they if they flew further out and over the ocean, for example? I mean, how could
Well, the concern
that?
is if they have to get in over the bay for their landing.
Okay.
So they've got to get low enough as they're coming closer to the airport. So whatever they do out over the ocean, by the time they come in toward Palo Alto, toward what we call the Menlo Waypoint, they've got to start getting down to get ready to get on final approach. And that's where we're stuck. We're sort of right in the bottleneck where they're trying to get into the airport and get lined up for their final approach. And the FAA has said it's so crowded with all this other airspace, we don't know how else to get you lined up for the airport if you're coming from these certain directions. And so we keep saying, well, then let's get more creative. We've come up with sort of 12 ideas outside the box. Meet us halfway. Are you willing to think outside the box? Can we readjust some of the other airspace? Can we do something else?
One of the big issues that came up, there's this shift or a different flight path that they put in called SURFR. That's the acronym for it. And when they put that one in and it comes more from west to east and goes over and then goes north going over to Palo Alto. One of the issues is that why couldn't we go back to what was called the Big Sur flight path? And when the FAA had the first phase of their responses or recommendations, they said that it might be possible to move that. That was something they thought was feasible, to go back to the Big Sur flight path or something close to it. In this second phase that just came out, the second report that came out in November, have they said one way or the other whether or not they're going to continue along that path?
There's a lot of conversation in the community around what's going to happen with that. And there has been a lot of suggestions by some folks in the community that they've heard that there will be some action around that. And they've even got potential dates, August perhaps. We haven't heard any of that verified directly from the FAA. But that's also not an issue that the Palo Alto City Council has taken a formal position on. If you look at the difference between the Big Sur track and the new Surfer track that you're talking about, it had a big impact over by the coast because it moved planes between sort of Santa Cruz and Capitola and where they start coming in. But those two tracks come closer and closer together the closer you get to the bay. And by the time they get over Palo Alto, they're fairly close together. So there are some neighborhoods within Palo Alto that are more affected by one than the other. But I think if you look at the city of Palo Alto as a whole, it's likely to be impacted either way. I don't know that for sure. I haven't confirmed that for sure. But the city of Palo Alto has yet to take a position on that particular issue. It did come up in a meeting we had this week where residents did ask our council to take a closer look at that, and I did commit to our council that I'd do some more research on it and bring it back so that they could take a closer look at that issue.
You're touching upon something that I think is really inherently problematic about airplane noise, which is when you're moving it off of one path, you're moving it onto another path and over someone else's house. Right. And I think the regional coordination issue is particularly fascinating. And it seems like there's been a little bit of progress just in getting everyone to talk to each other, where that hadn't happened a couple of years ago. I understand that there have been a couple ad hoc committees that have formed, and we have some representation on those now.
Yes, there's an ad hoc committee organized by San Jose Airport to talk about what's called the South Flow. And that has some impact on Palo Alto as well. And council member Lydia Koo sits on that group. That group is trying to get its work done in about 120 days. So it's a temporary committee. Then the Santa Clara County Cities Association has created an ad hoc group to do the work of designing a permanent group. So council member Greg Scharfs is chairing the temporary ad hoc committee that is working to design whether or not we can create a permanent committee. Who sits on the permanent committee would remain to be seen. Mm-hmm. But the hope is that that would be a new South Bay roundtable that would involve all of the cities in the county in Santa Clara, as well as our neighbors in Santa Cruz County. Mm-hmm. And that Santa Clara and Santa Cruz counties could come together and form a roundtable modeled somewhat after the San Francisco Airport roundtable.
Which we haven't had any representation on.
Although there's movement there. The SFO Roundtable is now reaching out to Santa Clara County and Santa Cruz County and asking whether each one of those counties would be interested in taking one seat on the roundtable.
There's about, what, like 20 seats there? So
There are.
So I wouldn't put too much hope in having representation SFO, especially since priorities are somewhat different as they are for the North. Yeah. But as far as, I'm quite interested in the second committee because I feel like that would probably be the Palo Alto's and its neighbors' best bet to kind of counterbalance SFO and some of the other priorities. So do you have any sense about their timeline? I mean, you mentioned 120 days is the San Jose timeline. Does the Cities Association one have any kind of
I think it's
roadmap?
too early to tell. They've done a lot of really good work in researching how the SFO roundtable is designed to see if we can simplify, instead of starting from scratch, try to model whatever you can after whatever's already been figured out by others. So I think they're trying to expedite it to the extent possible, but it's going to take some time to figure out not just the politics of how many seats and how does that work, but practically the government doesn't move quickly on purpose because we want to make sure we have checks and balances. And so having 15 cities in a county, they will each probably have to adopt a resolution of their own, agreeing to be a part of this body, agreeing how that will work, agreeing whether or not funding will be involved and how funding will work. So just getting something on 16 different agendas is, logistically time-consuming. And before that happens, we have to figure out what does that look like and what's being presented. So right now they're meeting, they're trying to meet monthly to figure out what the bylaws will look like, what the structure will look like, so that they can move on that as ambitiously as possible.
Great. And I know Jocelyn mentioned at the very beginning that one of the kind of frustrations with this topic is that the city doesn't really have control, but it does have some tools at its disposal to kind of talk to the FAA. There's Congress people, there's a caucus devoted to quiet skies in the House, I think. And Palo Alto has lobbyists also in DC kind of working on this issue. I'm just curious, have any of these efforts made a difference, and is there any other strategies for kind of addressing the federals where they are?
I think they make a big difference. I've worked in the federal government in the past as well as local government, and it's really unusual for a federal agency to produce a report to a large community in response to its congressional delegation. And that's what we've seen coming out of the FAA. We've been very disappointed with the content in that report. But I think it really demonstrates that our congressional delegation has been very effective in holding the FAA accountable to respond to our concerns, to hear from the SFO Roundtable and the Select Committee, and to give answers to the community's questions. So I think that really makes a difference.
Yeah. And it seems to me like airplane noise is almost like the top unofficial priority of the council. When I went to their retreat last month, there were probably more people talking about airplane noise than anything else, though it hasn't been officially adopted because the city doesn't have much control. But it seemed like at last week's meeting that some of these residents who've been dealing with this for a few years are getting a little bit fed up with the FAA's response and are urging the city to sue, kind of take a harder stance. And I know you're not the city attorney, but I'm curious whether other cities have taken this route, and if, from what you've read up on the subject, if they've had any success in taking legal action to kind of make their cases.
There have been a couple of successful legal cases and a number of unsuccessful ones as well. And you really have to look at them on a case-by-case basis. And each set of circumstances is different. The grounds for why you would sue in the first place are really important to understand. And usually those are about process more than we're being impacted and it's not fair. There's no law against making too much noise, as unpleasant as that is for us. And so to even find what the legal grounds would be is a tricky situation for the attorneys, and that's what they're up against.
So it sounds like they're not moving too aggressively to do losses at this time. Sounds like for that reason.
Well,
technical.
I think I know that at our last meeting this week with the Policy and Services Committee, the direction from the council members to our city attorney was to look into the options for legal action. So they actually are looking into that, and we'll follow up with our council about that.
So the fundamental problem here is noise and how people are bothered by it morning, noon, and night. There were a couple mentions of ideas about monitoring noise and then also improving metrics. And what I don't understand is the noise being monitored at all right now, and if so, how? And what do improved metrics mean for
Sure.
monitoring noise?
So SFO Airport does do noise monitoring in partnership with communities that surround the airport. We're quite a bit farther away than the typical community that would benefit from noise monitoring by the airport. Traditionally, noise monitoring was primarily focused around the really high decibel levels you get when you're very, very close to the
Next to
airport.
it, uh-huh.
And so what happened with NextGen is we've got a different dynamic going on where the procedures for approaches changed, and so we're being affected by noise in a different way. It's not just the landing itself, it's the approach. That's something new for the FAA to be dealing with. So when we talk about metrics, we're talking about now that you've got a whole new way of flying planes. We used to just fly them by radar, and now we're using satellite technology to bring them in through different procedures. That's affecting, our argument would be, that's really affecting how the whole system operates. And so we need to think about noise in new and different ways and classify noise measurements and take noise measurements and analyze noise in new and different ways, because the nature of the system has changed so much that the impacts on the ground are really different and the old model doesn't work anymore. So that's the conversation we'd really like to engage with the FAA about and encourage them to embrace it.
Has the agency been acceptable of that so far? The need to reevaluate how it measures noise?
They were silent on it in their report, and the House of Representatives has included language in its current FAA legislation that would direct the FAA to start working on this. So we're hopeful that some legislation will move forward to move the agency in that direction.
It's kind of interesting to see really how they've been dragging their feet on this issue, because going back to 2000 when they had their agreement with the city of Palo Alto and with Congresswoman Eshoo, they brought together this idea that they were supposed to put some sort of noise monitoring, decibel level monitoring device in place, I think over at the Menlo Waypoint, and they never did it. They didn't do it, they say, because, well, the economy tanked, and so therefore we had other priorities, or we didn't have the money, so on and so forth. But it doesn't seem, I think you could probably get, in fact, we picked up a decibel meter ourselves for $25 online. So, I mean, you can get something like that.
As the economy turned around.
Yeah. It seems to me that they ought to be able to do something. And
Well, I
that
think
for 17 years, they haven't done anything, 18 years now.
And I think they're willing to do something. So
Yeah.
I've had some informal conversations with the folks in the noise office at SFO, and they've said, we had a previous agreement to do noise monitoring, the one you're referring to, and while some might make an argument that that's expired or it's no longer relevant, we would be willing to honor that and do noise monitoring with you in partnership on a temporary basis. So that's a starting conversation, and once our council gives us a green light to move forward in that direction, we'll likely be talking with SFO about doing that. We could certainly explore doing noise monitoring on our own, but I think everyone agreeing on the data and the methodology is going to tee us up to be more successful in the long run.
I think that's true. That's very true in terms of the airplane noise groups, local ones that, the residence groups. They have had a lot of, even though they've done a lot of information and data gathering, it hasn't really been accepted by FAA for that reason. Like, who are you, basically? And we might question your methodology, but FAA hasn't really come up with any of their own. And I think that's been a big sticking point with people is, nothing, even though you may have to measure it in different ways, it still needs to be measured, because it is noise that is the constant. That is the thing that is affecting people.
That's right. And at the end of the day, what we're really committed to is quality of life. And we need to ground back into that, because it's really easy to get lost in debating how many angels you can fit on the head of a pin when you start talking about this route or that route or this decibel level. But what we're really talking about is this is affecting people's lives, and can we come together and try to reach some agreement to actually address what's affecting people and find a path to do that.
It seems like we're at a critical point right now, not only because the issues are in front of us and still need to be resolved, but there are plans, are there not, for expanding flights to SFO and San Jose and Oakland as well. So this is going to amplify.
That's right. All three airports have business plans that project considerable growth in the coming years, and they've all been growing recently. So just in the last 5 years, SFO's grown by 25% in terms of activity. Oakland's grown by about 31%, and San Jose's grown by over 50%.
Wow.
So all three airports are becoming more and more active, and they're scheduled to have even more activity. And that's both in terms of passenger travel and cargo. So, transportation is about the movement of people and goods, and these are big economic issues for the region and the nation, the airline industry. So there are a lot of stakeholders at the table, and figuring out how we most effectively get a seat at that table so that our residents' concerns are weighed alongside with all of those other competing interests is one of the things we're really focused on.
One of the things that's in one of the federal documents, not the recent ones from FAA, but earlier that had to do with the whole what Congress had FAA put together in the first place that led to the next gen, was they talked about the role of drones and the need for airspace for drones. And I wondered if you've come across anything that shows how big of a factor that's likely to be or is considered to be in terms of air traffic?
It's interesting you bring that up. The next gen issue has been a long time coming. I mean, we started moving to GPS in the 90s, right? That's when satellite GPS first really came on the market to public consumers. And way back then, the FAA recognized that using radar is not going to make sense in the long term, and we need to transition. And it really took about 25 years for the FAA to get its arms around how are we going to redesign air traffic control nationwide in the new world of satellite technology. And during those conversations, of course, drones emerged as well. And so that's another issue that I think has been acknowledged. But in answer to your question, in the FAA reports responding to these concerns, I saw no references to drones, and I haven't heard that come up directly. I think this is really about shifting from radar to satellite and how you make that work.
Well, I think we're going to need to wrap it up for today. But thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us and giving us the latest on the airplane noise issue and where things stand for the city of Palo Alto and the FAA. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. Please subscribe or like us below. You can always find us on paloaltoonline.com. If you'd like to comment on this issue, and a number of people have based on Gennadi's story this week, you can go to Town Square, which is our community discussion forum, paloaltoonline.com/square, and find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll see you next week.